Imagine like walking into a situation and you just already know like what the other person's weaknesses are.
Hmm.
Or maybe you can kind of see a problem coming before it even starts.
Yeah.
It's kind of a powerful feeling, right? To have that kind of strategic edge.
Yeah, definitely. That idea of like understanding and anticipating, that's like so fundamental, I think, to so many things that we do.
Well, that's what we're looking at today. We're tapping into this like timeless source of strategic wisdom today. We're going deep on Sun Tzu's Art of War and specifically chapter 9, The Army on the March.
Okay.
And, I don't want you to just think about old battlefields when we're talking about this. We're going to extract from this the underlying principles that are relevant in all sorts of conditions, not just warfare.
Right.
And that's kind of what this whole deep dive is about, is giving you that quick but thorough knowledge
Exactly.
so that you can just understand how to read any situation, how to understand the terrain.
Mhm.
And I mean that both literally and figuratively. And then most importantly, how to position yourself to win no matter what you're doing.
Hmm.
So we've gone through and distilled some of these key principles out of this chapter to help give you that strategic edge.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about this chapter in particular is that it's called The Army on the March. But the things that he talks about in this chapter are really applicable in any situation where you're trying to understand your environment and the people around you.
Right.
The idea of thinking strategically about where you are, where you need to go,
Mhm.
and anticipating what others are going to do.
Okay, so like one of the first things that really jumped out at me in this chapter was just how much emphasis Sun Tzu puts on the terrain.
Hmm.
It's not just like where things are happening. He's saying it actually shapes the outcome.
Yeah, and it's not just like high-level conceptual stuff either.
Yeah.
It's very practical. I mean, one of the first things he says is, pass quickly over mountains and keep in the neighborhood of valleys. And on the surface, that's about moving efficiently, right? Don't get bogged down. But it's also about using the terrain to your advantage, using it for cover, for
Mhm.
strategic positioning.
Mm.
And you can almost think about it in a modern context, like if you're talking about business, it's almost like understand the market landscape, know where the safe paths are,
Okay.
stick to maybe well-established channels, but keep in mind that there might be these new avenues opening up as well.
So he even gets into really specific stuff, like when you're making camp, he says camp on high ground,
Yeah.
face the sunny side. I mean, he almost sounds like he's giving us tips for like going on a hike,
Yeah.
but he's framing this as a key strategic move.
Right.
So why is that so significant?
I think when you look at it from the perspective of why would a military commander in ancient China be concerned about this?
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about, well, what are the benefits that it provides?
Okay.
Being on higher ground gives you visibility. You can
Okay.
see what's coming. In a business context, that might be like, having a good understanding of the market trends, being able to see what your competitors are doing.
Gotcha.
Facing the sun, that can be used to like disorient an approaching enemy.
Okay.
So think about like, what would that be in a business context? Maybe like slightly disrupting your competitor's strategy or something like that.
Right.
And then just from a purely logistical standpoint, like sunny spots are generally healthier places to camp. You're going to have less risk of disease.
Makes sense.
And Sun Tzu actually points this out, that, keeping your troops healthy is vital for victory. And I think in any competitive situation, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You don't want to be fighting an uphill battle literally, but also figuratively.
He also says specifically, don't fight uphill.
Right, exactly.
I mean, that's just good advice, right?
Yeah, it takes more energy to go uphill. And tactically, you're at a disadvantage.
Right.
And it's like trying to launch a new product when you're competing against a really well-established market leader with way more resources than you.
Right. So you're just putting yourself at a disadvantage right from the start.
Exactly.
Okay, so water also features really prominently in this chapter.
Mm.
So when you're talking about crossing rivers, like what are some of the key strategic insights there?
So when it comes to rivers, there's a lot of specific tactical advice that he gives, but the principle is really about not being vulnerable.
Okay.
So for example, he says, don't engage an enemy that's trying to cross a river when they're halfway across.
Okay.
Let it get most of the way across, then you can strike,
Okay.
because now they're divided.
Okay.
And similarly, if you're crossing the river, he says, once you're across, move away from the river
Okay.
because you don't want to be trapped there. And if you think about that in a modern context, like negotiation, that's a similar principle.
Okay.
Like you don't want to make your big concessions right at the beginning.
Right.
And once you've come to an agreement, you don't necessarily want to linger in that spot. You might be vulnerable there.
Right.
So it's about kind of controlling the space, controlling when you engage and when you disengage.
Okay. And then there's the specific instruction about how to moor your boats.
Yeah.
He says moor them higher up.
Yeah.
Face them towards the sun. What's the thinking there?
I think it's kind of the same principle. It's
Yeah.
about like being deliberate about even these small details.
Okay.
So mooring your boats higher up
Huh.
prevents them from drifting downstream.
Okay.
So that's a practical consideration.
Right.
And you don't want them drifting into enemy hands.
Right.
And facing them towards the sun, again, can give you this slight visual advantage, make it more difficult for people to see what you're doing.
Interesting.
And he even says, do not move upstream to meet the enemy.
Okay.
So again, it's about like holding the more advantageous position, even on the water.
Gotcha.
And I think in a modern context, it's kind of like controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
Like, think about if you're in a PR crisis, you want to get out in front of it.
Right.
You want to be the one setting the terms of the engagement.
Okay, so we've got mountains, we've got rivers. What about other types of terrain,
Mm-hmm.
like dense forests or swampy areas?
Yeah. So he gives specific advice for all kinds of different terrain.
Okay.
So, for example, he talks about narrow passes, these defiles.
Okay.
And he says, if you're going through a narrow pass, the first thing you need to do is secure any wooded areas,
Okay.
because those are places where an enemy could hide.
Right.
And if the enemy has already occupied those woods, he says, don't try and force your way through.
Okay.
It's about recognizing when a position is just too fortified.
Right.
Like, don't waste your energy and resources.
Hmm.
And when it comes to swampy ground, he says, occupy open ground where you can, but keep your flanks protected by trees.
Okay.
So that gives you a little bit of maneuverability, but also protects you from being surprised.
Makes sense.
And if you think about it in a business context, it's almost like find a defensible niche.
Okay.
Find something where you've got some natural barriers to entry.
So it really just comes down to this fundamental idea of, like, choose where you fight. Choose your ground wisely.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of summarizes this by saying that in any place where you can set up camp, occupy the sunny spots.
Hmm.
Make sure you have your supply line secure, that you have access to resources.
Okay.
Safeguard what you have. All of that kind of contributes to your ability to win.
Right.
And then he reiterates, take the sunny hills first,
Okay.
keep the shady slopes to your rear,
Yeah.
very specific military advice.
Right.
But it's all about, like, taking the high ground,
Yeah.
literally and figuratively.
So then he also talks about, we were talking about rivers before.
Yeah.
He talks about what to do when you encounter a river that's swollen from rain.
Hmm.
And it's not just like, how do you cross it?
Right.
He's talking about when do you cross it?
Exactly. He says, don't try to cross a river that's all foamy and raging from a recent rain.
Okay.
Wait for it to subside.
Mm.
And it's almost like this really, like, Zen principle.
Mm.
It's like, be patient.
Mm-hmm.
Don't force action when the conditions aren't right.
Right.
And that's applicable in so many situations.
Yeah.
Like, wait for the market conditions to be favorable. Don't rush your product launch.
Right.
Sometimes the best action is to just wait.
He also gives this, it sounds like almost like a travel warning.
Yeah.
For ancient generals. He lists all these types of terrain that you should avoid at all costs.
Yeah, precipitous cliffs, torrents, deep hollows, confined places, tangled thickets, quagmires, and crevasses.
Yeah, get away from those.
And he doesn't just say avoid them yourself. He says try to lure the enemy into them.
Okay.
Keep those things at your back.
Mm.
And it's like, use the terrain as a trap for your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
And again, in a business context, that might be something like identify your competitor's weakness and then kind of subtly nudge them in that direction.
Yeah, right.
So they fall into that trap.
Okay, so we've talked about understanding the battlefield,
Hmm.
the literal terrain. But then he also goes into this whole other level,
Yeah.
which is observing the enemy.
Right.
And it's almost like he's saying you can read their intentions without them even saying a word.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really impressive about this chapter is the level of detail that he goes into.
Right.
So he's talking about, you need to carefully scout hilly country,
Okay.
ponds with aquatic grass,
Yeah.
reed-filled basins,
Hmm.
woods with thick undergrowth, because those are all places where an enemy could hide
Right.
or where they could put spies.
Right.
And it's about, anticipating where your opponent might try to gain an advantage.
It's like getting into their head, thinking about where would I hide if I were them.
Exactly.
And then he talks about how to interpret their behavior.
Hmm.
So for instance, if an enemy is nearby but they're quiet, I mean, that seems like a good thing. But what does Sun Tzu say about that?
He says if the enemy is near and they remain quiet, it means they're relying on the strength of their position.
Hmm.
They don't feel the need to be aggressive because they think they're in a good spot.
Okay.
But on the other hand, if they maintain a distance and they try to provoke a battle, that means they want you to advance.
Okay.
They want you to come to them.
Gotcha.
And they probably think that you'll be at a disadvantage if you do that.
It's like they're trying to bait you into a trap.
Right, exactly. Like, you go into a negotiation and the other side seems super accommodating,
Right.
but maybe they're just trying to lull you into a false sense of security.
Right. Make you make the first move.
Exactly.
What about if their encampment seems like it's really easy to approach?
That's another one of those classic deceptions.
Oh, okay.
So he says, if their camp is easy to approach, be suspicious.
Okay.
It's probably a lure. They
Mm.
might be feigning weakness,
Okay.
or they could have a surprise waiting.
Right, like an ambush or something.
Right. And you can even think about it in like a business sense.
Mm.
Like there's a company and they're seemingly struggling.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they come out with this amazing product that nobody saw coming.
Right, they were just playing possum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So don't be deceived by appearances.
So even something as simple as like movement within a forest, he says, can be a sign.
Yeah, he says if you see movement among the trees in a forest, it means the enemy is advancing.
Okay.
It's just like a straightforward visual cue.
Right.
And similarly, if you see like a lot of screens or like camouflage positions in the grass, be suspicious
Okay.
because they're obviously trying to hide something.
Right.
And again, you can think about that in a business context.
Mm.
Like your competitors being really secretive about a new project.
Right.
There might be a sign that they're about to do something big.
Then he gets into like, I love this, the signals from the natural world, talking about the behavior of birds and animals.
Yeah, this is one of those parts where it's like, wow, this guy was really paying attention.
Right.
So he says, birds suddenly taking flight, that's a good indication that there's a hidden enemy nearby,
Okay.
maybe an ambush. And startle animals, that means a sudden attack is about to happen.
Okay.
So it's like, be aware of your surroundings. Notice when the natural patterns are disrupted.
Right.
And in a modern context, that might be something like pay attention to unusual market fluctuations
Okay.
or sudden changes in your competitor's behavior.
So then he gets into a little bit more obvious signs.
Mm.
Like, you see dust clouds in the distance. There's an army on the move.
Right.
But even that, he breaks it down with surprising detail.
Yeah, he talks about different kinds of dust clouds.
Okay.
So a high column of dust means it's chariots.
Okay.
Low but wide dust means infantry. Scattered dust means they're collecting firewood,
Okay.
which means they're probably going to be there for a while. And a few little dust clouds moving back and forth means they're setting up camp.
Gotcha.
So you can tell a lot about the enemy just by looking at the dust.
Right. So you can kind of assess their size, their type, what they're up to.
Exactly. And again, there are parallels in the modern world.
Okay.
Like you can analyze your competitors' logistical movements.
Right.
To try to figure out how much they're producing or where they're expanding.
Then he talks about, not just visual signs, but verbal and preparatory signals as well.
Yeah. So he talks about, for example, if the enemy is using humble words, but they're making a lot of preparations, that means they're about to advance.
Oh, okay.
So they're trying to lull you into a false sense of security.
Right.
On the other hand, if they're using a lot of aggressive language and they're making a big show of force, but they don't actually attack, that probably means they're about to retreat. They're trying to look strong while they sneak away.
Right.
It's kind of like bluffing in poker. You talk a big game when you have a weak hand.
Right. Try and scare them off. What about, so he talks about how they deploy their forces. So if you see light chariots on the flanks, what does that tell you?
That means they're getting ready for battle.
Okay.
So they're putting their light chariots on the wings to protect their main force.
Okay.
And maybe to try and outmaneuver you on the sides.
Okay.
And you can see that in a business context as well.
Right.
Companies will put support teams around their key product lines to try to protect them.
And then peace proposals.
Yeah.
I mean, you think that's always a good thing, but Sun Tzu actually gives a warning about those.
He says if somebody offers you peace, but they don't back it up with a sworn agreement, be suspicious.
Okay.
Because it could be a trick.
Okay.
They could be trying to buy time.
Right.
Or lull you into lowering your defenses.
Right. So it's like, they're giving you this offer that seems good on the surface,
Right.
but you need to look for the actual commitment.
Exactly. It's like a competitor offering you a partnership,
Right.
but they don't want to sign a contract.
Right, exactly.
So always be wary of those kind of things.
So what about if you see like a lot of rapid movement?
Mm,
Like soldiers are falling in rank really quickly.
that's a sign that something big is about to happen.
Okay.
So either they're about to attack or they're responding to something that you've done.
Right,
It's like, when you see all the key players in a company suddenly called into an emergency meeting,
right.
you know something's going down.
What about, so he talks about this tactic of advancing and retreating at the same time.
Yeah, so this is a classic feint.
Okay.
You send some of your troops forward and some of them back at the same time.
Right,
And it's meant to confuse the enemy.
right,
Make them think you're doing one thing when you're actually doing another.
right. And make them make a mistake.
Exactly. And, there are parallels in the modern world.
Right,
Think about like limited time offers. They create this sense of urgency.
right,
They're trying to get you to act without thinking.
right.
So it's a similar kind of psychological tactic.
So he also, I love this, he gets into the physical condition of the soldiers themselves.
Hmm.
And he's saying, if you see them leaning on their spears, that's a sign.
Yeah, he says if soldiers are leaning on their spears, they're probably tired and hungry.
Okay.
They're demoralized.
Mm,
And similarly, if you see soldiers going to get water
yeah.
and they drink themselves before they fill up their canteens, that means the whole army is thirsty.
Gotcha.
So these are little clues that tell you about the overall state of the enemy forces.
Right, like their morale, their physical condition.
Exactly. And, you can apply that to teams as well.
Right,
If you see signs of burnout, that's going to affect their productivity,
right.
their ability to focus.
What about if they have a clear opportunity to take advantage of something, but they don't do it?
He says if the enemy has a chance to gain ground, but they don't, it's a sign of exhaustion.
Yep.
They're too tired to take advantage of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, when you see a competitor who just completely misses a market opportunity,
Right.
it might be because they're struggling internally.
Right, they just don't have the resources or the energy.
Exactly.
He also talks about, going back to the natural world, if you see birds gathering in a specific area, that can be a clue.
Yeah, he says if birds are gathering, it usually means that spot is unoccupied.
Okay.
And if you hear a lot of noise and commotion in the enemy camp at night, that means they're nervous.
Okay.
They're not sleeping well.
Right.
And again, you can think about that in a modern context.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
if you see a lot of unusual social media activity from your competitor,
Right.
it might be a sign that they're having some internal turmoil.
He also talks about, looking for signs of internal problems within the enemy camp.
Yeah, he says if there's a lot of disturbance in the camp, it means the general has lost control. If you see banners and flags moving around, that could be a sign of sedition.
Mm-hmm.
Like the troops are not following orders.
Right.
And if you see angry officers, that means the troops are probably tired and demoralized.
Okay.
So it's like, you see those same kinds of things in companies.
Right.
When there's internal conflict, it's a sign of instability.
Right. Then he gets into some, pretty extreme signs.
Yeah.
Like, if they're destroying their supplies,
Hmm.
what does that tell you?
He says if they're feeding their horses grain, killing their cattle, and not even setting up cooking pots, that means they're determined to fight to the death.
Okay.
They're not planning on coming back.
Hmm.
And in a business context, that might be like a company betting everything on a single product launch.
Right.
They're all in.
What about things like soldiers whispering among themselves?
Yeah, he says if you see soldiers whispering, that means there's disaffection in the ranks.
Hmm.
They're not communicating openly. There
Right.
could be problems brewing.
And then finally he talks about, how the army is managed, the use of rewards and punishments.
Yeah, he says if you see a lot of rewards being given out, it could mean that the enemy is running low on resources,
Okay.
and they're trying to keep morale up.
Right.
And as you see a lot of punishments, that means they're in distress.
Gotcha.
There's widespread disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're boasting a lot, but then they get scared when they see how many troops you have, that means they're not very smart.
Okay.
They're not thinking strategically.
What about if they send envoys to you with compliments?
That probably means they want a truce.
Okay.
They're trying to negotiate from a position of strength.
And finally, he talks about if you're in a prolonged standoff, what should you be looking for?
He says if the enemy marches forward aggressively, but then just sits there, be very careful.
Oh,
They could be waiting for reinforcements,
right.
or They could be trying to figure out your weaknesses.
Mm.
It's a very tense situation.
Right, so like a game of chicken.
Exactly. Nobody wants to make the first move.
So after all of this incredible detail about observing the enemy, he moves into some more overarching strategic principles.
Hmm.
And like one that really stands out is that just having equal numbers is not enough.
Yeah, he says, if your forces are just equal in number to the enemy, that's not sufficient.
Okay.
You can't rely on that alone.
Mm-hmm.
You need a strategy.
Right.
And even if you have superior numbers, that's no guarantee of victory either,
Right.
if you don't use those numbers wisely.
He also says that you shouldn't attack an enemy that's perfectly ordered.
Mm.
Like, if they're all lined up and ready to go, don't just charge in.
Right.
You need to be a little more clever than that.
Yeah, he says you need to use a crafty scheme.
Okay.
You need to outsmart them. And this is where he uses that great analogy of water. He says, in war, the creation of a fixed disposition of forces is like the principle of water. For water in its course avoids high places and rushes downwards. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak.
So, like, water doesn't flow uphill.
Right.
It finds the path of least resistance.
Exactly. And in war, you should do the same thing.
Right.
Don't attack the enemy where they're strong.
Okay.
Find their weak points and exploit them. And in a business context, that's like, don't try to go head-to-head with the biggest player in the market.
Right.
Find a niche where you can compete.
And then he also says that just as water adapts to the shape of the terrain, a commander should adapt their tactics to the enemy. So, like, water doesn't have a fixed shape.
Right.
It changes depending on where it's flowing.
Yeah, he says water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing.
Okay.
And what he's saying is that, warfare is not static.
Right.
You have to be flexible. You have to adapt to the situation.
He actually says there is no constant condition in warfare.
Right, exactly. It's always changing. And that's why he talks about the heaven-born captain.
Okay, so it's not like some divine right to rule.
No,
Yeah.
no, not at all. He's talking about somebody who has the natural ability to adapt,
Okay.
to change their tactics depending on who they're facing. And that's how they achieve victory.
So like a leader who can, sense how the market's changing.
Right.
And adjust their company accordingly.
Exactly. Somebody who's got vision, who can see the big picture, and who's not afraid to change course.
He also mentions the cyclical nature of things. He talks about the 5 elements, the seasons.
Yeah, I think he's bringing that in to emphasize the fact that things are always in flux.
Okay.
Nothing stays the same forever.
Right.
And a good leader understands that. They understand that the conditions are always changing, and they adapt accordingly.
He also gives this warning about avoiding decisive engagement. If your only goal is to preserve your own forces.
Yeah, he says if all you care about is keeping your army safe, you're going to be constantly harassed.
Okay.
You're never going to achieve a lasting victory.
Right.
And it's kind of a reminder that sometimes you have to take risks.
Right.
You have to be willing to commit if you want to achieve your goals.
And then he gets into this principle of concentrating your forces, which, that seems kind of common sense.
Yeah, it does seem obvious.
Right.
But I think it's worth reiterating.
Right.
Because it's so important.
So basically, if your forces are concentrated and the enemy is scattered, that's when you attack.
Right. You want to hit them where they're weak.